So, here we are, it's 1971, and heavy metal is just in its birth, it's not even truly been birthed yet. It's a seed that has only just recently been planted and is now starting to sprout, with Black Sabbath, taking that and really starting the whole heavy metal genre. It's 1971. What other band, what other album other than Black Sabbath is helping to birth heavy metal? What is one of the heaviest bands in 1971? Well, how about this band? Budgie. What do we think of Budgie here, SMOD fans? You better know this band. I'll be very disappointed if you don't know Budgie, because this is one of the heaviest albums of 1971 by far. It's right up there with Sabbath in terms of the heavy riffing and just this gnarly, down-tuned rumble, really dark stuff, really gritty, rumbling guitar playing. So Budgie's a band that needs to be discussed, and we're going to do that right now. I'm sure that many of you know Budgie, but for those that don't, they released an album every single year from 1971 to 1976. So 6 straight albums. And those first 5 albums are really amazing, okay? I'm focusing right now on this one just because it's kind of the heaviest, doomiest. I mean, it's pretty doomy and pretty heavy metal, pretty stoner rock and doom. It's the heaviest record that they put out by far. So I thought we would talk a little bit about this album today. Also, I do want to recommend this Budgie set if you can find it. It's really not too expensive if you can, you know the right places. Cough, Discogs, eBay. eBay and Discogs, yeah, you can find a lot of treasures on there for cheap. I don't know what I paid for this, but geez, it couldn't have been more than 10 to 15 bucks for 3 albums in one set. This has their 3rd album, Never Turn Your Back on a Friend. It has their 4th album, In for the Kill, and it has their 5th album. If you have these 4 albums, you've got 4 of the finest albums of the 70s. I swear to God, Budgie is one of my favorite bands from the 70s, maybe my favorite band as a whole in terms of entire output from the 70s. Budgie is legit. So, I'm going to do a rundown of the band today and talk about their first 5 albums, but specifically the self-titled and how doomy and heavy metal it really is. For 1971, you couldn't find much that was heavier than the self-titled debut of Budgie. And Burke Shelley, the lead singer, boy, once you hear him, you're going to say, wow, I've heard that somewhere. That's a distinct voice. Where have I heard that before? Well, you've heard it before. Rush. You've probably heard Rush. He sounds like the guy from Rush, Geddy Lee. But Budgie kicks Rush's ass. That's right, Budgie kicks Rush's ass. Not saying that Rush sucks, but Rush is extremely overrated compared to how Budgie has been fairly forgotten. And, you know, you're not going to hear Budgie on the radio a whole lot. You're not going to hear people talk about the greatest classic heavy metal bands, and they're not really going to talk about Budgie. Budgie was from Wales, probably the best band ever to come out of Wales. I can't name one that's better than them. And Burke Shelley, yeah, he's basically Geddy Lee fronting an even better, heavier band. So we're going to talk about Budgie today, and I'm going to give you some information and read some reviews that I wrote of some of their albums, and let's just get into the history of Budgie, shall we? All right, let's get into the history of one of the greatest and earliest heavy metal bands, Budgie. Budgie was formed in 1967, and they released their debut in 1971. This was one of the earliest and heaviest metal albums, and a big influence on stoner metal, stoner rock as well. Now, Budgie's original name was Hills Contemporary Grass. Now, I don't know about that name. Definitely not sure that would have caught on. It's a mouthful to say, Hills Contemporary Grass. The original lineup had Burke Shelley on vocals and bass, Tony Borge on guitar, and Ray Phillips on the drums. After several gigs in 1968, they decided to change their name to Budgie, and thankfully, as that is a much better name. Burke Shelley said that the name was from the fact that he loved the idea of playing noisy, heavy rock, but wanted something that sounded diametrically opposed to that. So I guess he thought Budgie sounded wimpy. They released Squawk the year after their debut in 1972. Now that was their second album. And then they released another album every year all the way through 1976. 6 albums in 6 years. A very prolific band. One of the most prolific bands of the early to mid-70s. The third album, Never Turn Your Back on a Friend, is perhaps their most famous album. It probably has the most famous Budgie song called Bread Fan, which is a really classic, great song. It was famously covered by Metallica. They were also covered by other heavy metal bands in the future as well. Covered by a lot of famous heavy metal bands, but Metallica really loved Budgie and covered them several times. Crash Course in Brain Surgery was also covered, and that's from In for the Kill, which was their 4th album. In 1975, they released their 5th album, which is one of my personal favorite Budgie albums, along with the self-titled debut album. Now, despite them having a large cult following and being a fairly respected band, obviously influential and respected by bands of the stature of Metallica, despite all this, they never really did get much mainstream success, especially in America. Although they built a particularly strong following in Poland, they just simply didn't get nearly as much success in America. They were, however, popular in Texas, and they received significant airplay in San Antonio in the 1970s. They were also played in St. Louis, but to this day, I really don't ever hear Budgie on classic rock radio here in the United States. I think that's a real shame. I don't even hear Bread Fan played, which you would think of all the songs that could be played on radio, that would be the one. A very underappreciated and underrated band in the grand scheme of things, on the mainstream level, on the everyday person's level. Very few people compared to, like, you know, if you compare Budgie to like Rush, which is a similar sounding band in a lot of ways, obviously Budgie's terribly underrated. I'm sure part of it is that they're not from the United States. I'm sure in Europe they have a much better following, but this is just a band that everyone should know. I mean, shit, if everyone knows Rush, I would hope everyone would know Budgie. Now, after Bandoiler, the band's style kind of started to change. It went from more of the heavy progressive rock and metal to more of a funky, experimental, less heavy direction I didn't like quite as much. Their first 5 albums are their best work. Unfortunately, Burke Shelley just recently passed away in 2022, so rest in peace to good old Burke Shelley. He is a legend in my mind, and I really love the guitar work of Tony Borge. I mean, that guy's a total riff monster. He really is. On the self-titled debut in particular, Tony Borge really lets it rip, and that is the heaviest Budgie album. I wrote a review of it in my group, so I'll read that for you now. It says, "Today I've got the 1971 self-titled debut by Budgie in my stereo. Budgie is one of my favorite classic rock bands, and I feel they don't get nearly enough credit. This Welsh power trio was one of the heaviest of the time, and I'd consider this debut a very early stoner rock album. From start to finish, the album blasts with pounding drums and down-tuned bass. The riffs are bluesy and heavy as hell. These guys were considered the Welsh Rush, and hearing Burke Shelley's vocals, it's easy to see why. Budgie actually started before Rush, which makes you wonder if Rush were maybe Budgie fans. Bottom line is this is a must-have classic for fans of early heavy metal and proto-stoner. These guys simply slayed. Budgie would go on to release several more classics throughout the 70s, but this debut is arguably their finest hour. Favorite tracks include the opening track Guts, which is a monstrous track. It's just heavy as hell and rumbles like crazy. I mean, if you have a good stereo system and you put on Guts, it really hits you hard right in the opening. Another good track is The Author, track 3. Then we get into Nude Disintegrating Parachutist Woman. That's a mouthful. This is a track of 8.5 minutes, which Budgie tended to have at least one pretty lengthy track on all their albums. Side 2 features Rape of the Locks, All Night Petrol, and the closing track Homicidal Suicidal. Now, Homicidal Suicidal is one of the best tracks on the album, and also one of the heaviest, much like the opening. So it opens and closes with really heavy, gritty, almost doomy songs. As is the theme with all Budgie's records, they have a couple of interlude-type, whimsical, soft songs, some whimsical type songs like Everything in My Heart and You and I, which are also a nice break from the heavy songs. It gives you a nice break from those. Each album has one or two of those in it. So that's going to wrap up this video. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my presentation today about one of the greatest heavy metal bands of all time, Budgie. Please go check them out if you haven't heard them. You won't regret it. Doom on, and I'll talk to you soon.